the question has come up multiple times recently, and I've made statements kind of squarely in one camp even recently, with the idea of what even is a fight, what counts as a fight. And the real answer is there's not really a defining metric, but at the very least, we can kind of go down the rabbit hole of some words. Now, I'm only going to go in English, bring up some French here and there, but the truth is, if if you look at like Japanese and Chinese and other places that do martial arts, they may have categorizational differences. But for the sake of our argument, let's just stick with English, and you'll see why it's not so clear cut. So the first thing is the word fight, right? In English, we kind of generally know what the word fight is. We know that two or more people are going at each other in a manner that is quite contentious. Oftentimes we will use it figuratively to talk about arguments, or even more figuratively about business functions or something like that. However, when we say fight, the image that pops into our head, like almost immediately, is kind of two people duking it out, right? We are probably not thinking exclusively striking. We're probably not thinking exclusively grappling. We're probably thinking somewhere in the general vicinity of people kind of contesting with one another in a variety of circumstances. And a lot of us, when we hear the word fight, especially in context, we think of an unregulated fight out in the real world. For those who do combat sports, then we start looking into the realm of like MMA and whatnot, and we start thinking of, well, combat sports, and that's where there's kind of a gray zone. But, so the word fight itself ultimately comes from a Proto-Germanic root, right? Fiuta, something like that. Please, I'm not a linguist. And it ultimately comes down to combat, contend with weapons, strive, attack, gain by fighting, or win, right? And that's a broad thing. The whole contend with weapons that's a little specific, right? Because we rarely ever think of a fight being exclusively with weapons, right? So that is kind of a strange one to put in, but when you consider the history of fighting, wrestling is kind of like just the social dominance game. It was a sporting thing. And when people were fighting, they were often fighting with weapons and stuff. So maybe it's a historical context thing. But the funny thing is that it might come from a Proto-Indo-European origin, peck, which would mean to pluck, like pulling the hair, from a sheep or something like that. And they think that the idea came from the idea of like maybe literally pulling on hair and stuff in a fight, right? Because like actual fights get down, and I am even kind of straddling lines. But when we think of kind of unregulated fights, oftentimes we think of people like grabbing and pulling hair. A while back, I read to you that paragraph from an old book on wrestling that was talking about boxing, and it literally mentioned pulling hair and soaping your hair so that they couldn't pull it so well. So perhaps that's where they thought of it, and that's where they say it's probably from, but they say it's possibly also from the Latin root of pugnus, which is fist. And so when you hear like pugnacious, right, it means combative and fighty, but pugnus is fist in Latin, and I didn't go digging up the ultimate origin of that, but it's also probably Proto-Indo-European, because everything goes back to the mythical language of Proto-Indo-European. All right, so that tells us a whole lot of nothing, right? Because that's just a whole lot of different things. I mean, strive, right? Strive. There's that figurative language, right? And then like attack is pretty specific. We're going to get to that in a second, right? Gain by fighting or win, right? I don't like it when they use the word in the definition, but sometimes it's unavoidable. But even just winning, like, how is that the context of fighting, right? There's a lot of ways to win things that don't involve fighting. So that's a strange correlation. So, right, the word itself doesn't tell us a whole lot of anything. So let's look at other words that we use. Let's look at martial arts culture. And let's look at two words that are roughly analogous. So in English, we often use the term spar to go live, right? We're talking about basically live training. Essentially, it is the same, we consider it the same thing as kumite in Japanese, right? Which is the partner drilling. And again, I've talked about that before and everything. I'm not going to get into that right now. Kumite is kind of its own thing. Randori is its own thing. Senshu, Senda are kind of their own thing. Senshu, Senda, and Randori are very similar in the idea of kind of like playing in the chaos, and that's a super loosey-goose translation. Don't take that as gospel. But so when we say spar, we all kind of know what we mean. We're talking about a facsimile or a mock fight. When we say spar, we know that we're not trying to hurt each other. However, and this is interesting, in the French, in Savate at least, they refer to competition as the assault. Now, of course, in the French, there's no L, it's A-S-S-A-U-T, assault. And assault just means to attack, but it ultimately comes down to Latin, ad, which means to, and saltus, which means to leap. So whenever you hear a term salto in wrestling, that basically means that you're throwing somebody, you're making somebody fly through the air. A salto is literally a throw, which makes them fly through the air. They're not technically leaping, we're making them leap. But that's an interesting thing. Now, here's the thing. The French use that term for their competition. And of course, their sparring, which is not a word that you see at least in the historical documents, is still referred to as the assault. And one of the things that you'll notice is that spar, right, it comes from the French or the Italian, right, esparare to, or espare, right, to kick, or from the Italian sparare to fling. Cultural context matters in those cases, right? But ultimately from the Latin, ex, which means from, and parare means to prepare, which again, we get the word peri from, which the French use the word parade, parade, right? Which actually just means to stop. And it's in the sense of a parade is something you stop and watch, right? It's something you stop and you let pass. That's a whole other story for now. But parare, to prepare, or right, prepare from, right? In the sense of, right, you are basically trying to defend yourself against somebody coming in at you. And then the assault is the attack. And so in a sense, spar and assault are yin and yang to each other. Assault is the offensive side and spar is the defensive side in a very figurative sort of way. That tells us a little bit more, right? But it still doesn't tell us everything. Because really what we're getting at here is just the idea of there is an attack happening. Well, that kind of fits in under fight. So is sparring a fight? We don't refer to it as such unless people get out of hand. There is an inherent contextual idea in the word fight that we're talking about higher stakes. We're talking about stakes of possibly injury. We're definitely talking about stakes of like knockout and submission. We are talking about potentially stakes of escalation beyond that if you're talking outside of sporting competition. That's an interesting idea to play with. And then I wanted to bring in here, this is just something I remember from back in the day. I was watching, it was like Monday Night Raw or something like that. I'm pretty sure it was WWE. It had to have been WWE because it was pretty sure it was Triple H that said it. And he said, I want to have a match with you, not a fight, right? I want to do this the right way, right? And again, he was making this distinction. And look, I know it's a show. I know it's a work. It's not real, but he's trying to make the distinction that what we're doing is a civilized match. It's a gentleman's match as opposed to a fight. The idea of a fight is a completely separate idea in that world from a match. And a match, again, it's the word match, right? It comes from Proto-Germanic, gamakon, something like that, fitting well together. Pretty obvious, right? We're literally talking about, two things of relative equality being paired up to one another. And it comes to us in the sense of a person able to contend with another, 14th century, 1300s in Middle English. So it takes on a figurative use, and that is very much a sporting context, right? The idea of a match. That's perhaps our first clue to the distinction between, say, a fight and a sporting contest is in the idea of a fight, we're left with something that is very big, broad, and general, and can definitely refer to all the way up to the most ultimate, brutal, savage, life-ending kind of event that you could possibly think of, and then down to the word match, which is specifically relating in a very real sense to the idea of combat sports, where you were looking for a contest between two equals. And now I just said the word contest, so let's change the board and get into some of these con words, because that's going to be another important piece of the puzzle. Words that get clumped in with those previous definitions are words that have this com prefix, com or con. They come from the same place. So they all go back to Latin. And so we have combat, conflict, and contest. Now, Latin, right, or combat in the Latin, right? So com or con, right? But they all come from this prefix com, which means with or together. Fun, interesting little tidbit. Had a debate briefly with somebody who was trying to say that combat always referred to many multiple opponents and not just one-on-one, because the com prefix means together or with. And I quickly pointed out that we have long by precedent at the very least, but honestly, even going back, have always referred to the idea of two sides clashing as together or with as well. So that kind of blew that out of the water. But the thing with that, then we have all of these, the core word of what is being said, right? So, combat, right, would combatere, something like that. Look, I took Latin in high school, but that's a long memory away, right? I'm 41 now. It's been a while. The word there, right, it literally just means to beat or fight, right? And again, that comes back to some of those previous words, meaning this kind of like clashing together. Now, the word fight itself doesn't. The word assault means to strike, right? But the idea of fighting from the Germanic roots that we have doesn't really have that direct sense of clashing or striking. But that's neither here nor there. We're talking about completely different languages. Remember, English is part Latin, part German, and then a bunch of other influences like Greek. And even our Latin is really French first and Latin later. So it's a whole mess. So just because you have different languages with different meanings doesn't mean they're not saying the same thing, just in slightly different ways. Then we have conflict, right? And again, conflict, we come down to the second word, fligere, meaning to strike. Again, we have that idea, to beat, to strike. So battuere, fligere, to strike. Fligere, that sounds kind of a lot like fling, right? Which we had before. I haven't looked that one up, so, go to Edom online and check. But just striking, right? And then, of course, with contest is a little bit different, right? So the second word, right, the second half, testari, actually means to bear witness, right? That's more of a legal term first. And later on, contest kind of came to mean matching people together to, to duke it out over whatever, right? And that's why we can call things contests that have nothing to do with fighting. Contest is just, it's bearing witness. It's basically like, what is the truth of the situation? In which case, when you have something that is a standardized competition, I didn't even put compete in here, but rest assured, compete comes in from kind of the same, the same roots. And this idea of a contest really is kind of in line with the idea of a match, right? So contest and match are somewhat analogous. And it really does seem like conflict and assault are somewhat analogous. And I would even say combat and assault are somewhat analogous, except we're talking about what is a fight here, right? In French, right? In the old books, they talk about combat and assault as being separate things. They talk about the assault as in kind of a sporting match, right? They're talking about it as either training or a sporting competition. Whereas when they talk about combat, they're talking about a real stakes fight. And that seems to be the major difference. And we know, again, I'm not getting into the Asian languages, but when you look at Chinese and Japanese, right, when they use terms like Sanshu, Sanda, and Kumite and Randori, those are referring to generally training exercises and even competitive formats. But when they talk about war or battle or like real fight, they often use a different word. And it should strike you then that there should be kind of a separation between the idea of like something that is matched and sporting or training or something like that versus something that is like, let's just call it real stakes. And that begs the real question, where do we draw that line? What do we consider as real stakes? What do we consider as like the real deal? What do we consider as just part of training? And what do we consider as the real thing? For a lot of these guys who are doing professional combat sports, whether it's MMA or kickboxing, boxing, there is some professional grappling out there, any of that kind of stuff, are the stakes not real when they're literally fighting for their paycheck? I mean, it's, and an actual injury is on the line, getting knocked out is on the line, getting, dislocated and stuff is on the line, potentially being laid up for months after just because of the cumulative damage, having the damage persist into old age and all of those downstream effects. Like, are those not real stakes? They are fairly real stakes. They just don't include the escalation or the unpredictability, the randomness, the unmeasuredness of what we often consider like a street fight or military combat or a police conflict or even a security thing like being, prison guarding, bouncing, something like that, right? Where potentially life is on the line, and it is technically still on the line in combat sports. It's just not officially on the line. It's just you inherently take the risk that you could have consequences that kill you. Whereas when you're talking about in a professional or unregulated street environment, oftentimes you're just talking about escalation factors that could lead to death. Excluding things like, flat out assassination and stuff, which is a completely different concept, because then that's not even a fight, right? That's somebody kind of hunting you, right? So that's a different story. But when we talk about this stuff, we do have to consider, like, what do we mean? What do we mean when we say a fight? There is a world of difference, and I've done videos on this in the past. There's a world of difference between the escalation and the high risk stakes of street combat, of law enforcement and security and military operations. There's a huge difference between that stuff and an MMA match or a kickboxing match or whatever. The question is, do the combat sports, and we call them combat sports, but that's just a modern term, right? But we call them combat sports because they are simulating combat. But the question is, are they high-risk sparring or are they a fight? And that's a question because we don't really have clear lines. There's so much overlap between all these terms, as we've just seen. So much overlap between these terms. It's like it exists on a continuum. And for me, the biggest thing, and the reason that I have a tendency not to call extremely limited combat sports a fight is, well, it's because they pull the stakes further and further away. They pull the variables further and further away. When we look at, let's just call it the natural environment, whatever time period you want to talk about, whatever continent you want to talk about, whatever amount of people you want to talk about, when we look at the natural environment and the way that fighting happens, violence takes on so many different shapes, right? There's social violence and asocial violence. There's group and there's single, and there's armed and unarmed, and there's so many contextual factors. Clearly, the natural environment does not have standardized, pre-agreed upon factors, whereas a sporting environment absolutely does, right? Because the entire purpose of a sporting environment really is to have a match where you remove as many of the unnecessary variables as possible just to see skill versus skill. Whereas in a fight, you're looking to settle some kind of grievance, right? I mean, that's kind of the entire reason we fight. There is some kind of grievance, unless you're dealing with process predators, in which case they don't have a grievance. They just enjoy the hunt. They enjoy the kill. That's a whole other side of things, right? But for the most part, let's just call it, anytime you're talking about mutual combat, right? You're talking about people settling agreements, no matter how thin it is. I don't like the color of your eyes, so I'm going to punch you in the nose, right? Whatever, right? You can make up any number of grievances that people might have that would end up leading to a fight, right? The famous topless duel of a countess and a noblewoman of other stature was supposedly over a flower arrangement. So, I mean, people have fought over the most ridiculous things, over misunderstandings, just over somebody being in a bad mood and doing something dumb. And when we talk about that stuff, we are generally looking at settling grievances versus test of skill. And that's almost kind of the line, right? Except it isn't, because the test of skill could be all the way up to lethal. We had lethal duels in the past. And settling grievances could be as something as mundane as a wrestling match, in which case nobody's getting injured and it's just a takedown or a pin. So it doesn't really tell us that much. It tells us a little bit, but not much. So when we're looking at this, right, what is a fight? And what do people mean when they say this is a fight, that's not a fight? And almost always, what they're really talking about is the stakes and the unpredictability of it, right? The stakes being that you're up to grievous bodily harm and beyond, and the escalation, up to and including multiple opponents and weapons. There are so many things in there. And so when we look at what combat sports might we consider a fight and what ones might we not consider a fight, and again, you kind of have to start looking at this on a sliding spectrum, right? The more limited something is, the more variables it has taken off the table, the more strict the rule set is, the more it's just a sporting match, in which case you really can't call it much of a fight. It's hard to call it a fight because you're taking it so far outside of what the natural environment would be that the translation effect isn't really there. And even if you were just to say let's artificially call MMA the pinnacle of combat sports of being real, right? Debatable, but let's just call it that, right? Because it has the broadest rule set. Even then, right, a lot of these very, very limited combat sports don't translate well into the full MMA game without some serious cross training in the months before, or more, depending on how much of a combat genius you are. And even then, right, like these sporting contests almost never involve weapons, and when we do see weapon contests, they're always for points. There's such a broad range and idea of what even is a fight. And it's a hard question to answer. And every time you come up with a thing, you go, yeah, but there's these other factors. Every single time. So again, you just got to kind of put it on a sliding scale, be kind of, be judicious with your words, and don't be afraid to give kind of some definitions and parameters for what you mean in the conversation. And if somebody disagrees with your usage of the words, find a middle ground that you can have a conversation on. It's not just stakes, it's not just escalation, it's not just the natural environment. Like, there are so many factors that go into what is a fight. All we can say for sure is that most people understand that there's a big difference between the training environment and a friendly contest versus like settling grievances, real fight. People understand that there's a difference, but there's a real big gray zone in the middle there that, man, it's really, really hard to say. So, like, we don't need to debate too hard about it, but you can see why this is a difficult question, why people might ask this question. You say, you've never been in a real fight, and they mean, they were a cop, and they mean you've never taken down an aggressive opponent with a kitchen knife. Or whatever. And then the other guy goes, yeah, well, you've never been in a real fight because all you do is arrest people, and you've never gone up against somebody who's your equal and can knock your brains out. And, we're going at it for 25 minutes, like, people will sit there and have these arguments, and it's context, man. It's context. The context flows from one place to another, and the stakes are different, and the bounds are different. The consequences are different. And the terms that we use are all kind of vague, kind of fit. And really the whole point of this is just to urge you to, one, be careful with your words, two, have a little grace, because people rarely mean exactly the same thing when they use the same words. And so put things in context, use modifiers, give contextual boundaries for what you mean when you say something, if there's even a shadow of a doubt of what you mean, right? It's accurate language, precise language is actually fairly important. You don't have to be overly pedantic. You don't have to be just like the semantic scholar or anything like that. That's really not what I'm saying. And I do think semantics matter, but it only goes so far. What we really need to be looking at is just being careful with our language, right? Use words that you understand. Don't use words that you don't understand. Make sure you look things up, right? We all walk around with the internet in our pockets. You can look up a dictionary, and I urge you, look at etymology. Look at etymology. Understand where the word comes from. A good etymology dictionary like Etym Online, and you'll see these links in the Substack, right? But a good etymology dictionary like Etym Online gives you a deep dive into where these words come from, and it'll still tell you what they mean today, right? So it gives you this, like, from the beginning all the way up to today, so you can see the path of how the word has kind of morphed and taken on maybe figurative aspects versus how some things have stayed fairly literal. And when words overlap, and if words overlap, that's totally cool. And sometimes they come from different languages, so they mean kind of the same thing, but maybe they have different implications. You just have some grace. Be precise and have some grace. And that may be difficult, but it is very useful, and it furthers conversation. So this has been a much longer video than I expected, is what it is. You've been here before. And I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.